Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover all about volume to maximize muscle growth. First, let's quickly cover what exactly volume is. Well, volume essentially refers to the total workload performed over a given time frame. This can be quantified in many different ways, but for hypertrophy training, the most appropriate method is to use the total number of sets performed per muscle group per week. This is because we know that hypertrophy can be equally achieved using a range of different rep ranges, loads, exercises, rest periods, frequencies, and more. So provided that all sets are taken sufficiently close to failure, they can all be considered equivalently hypertrophic regardless of what methods are implemented. This systematic review concluded that using the total number of weekly sets per muscle group is an adequate method to quantify volume for hypertrophy training when lifting anywhere in the approximate 6 to 20 rep range. So now that we understand what exactly volume is, let's now cover how volume influences muscle growth. It is quite clear in the research that when all other factors are equated, more volume tends to result in superior muscle growth. This meta-analysis analyzed the entire body of research exploring the effects of volume on hypertrophy. It was concluded that a dose-response relationship existed whereby more volume resulted in greater muscle growth, at least up to around 10 sets per week. However, 10 sets is probably considered quite a low amount of volume for most serious lifters. So the question becomes, does this dose-response relationship continue with higher volumes? Well, luckily, we have more research since this meta-analysis was published, answering this question. We have multiple studies now looking at extremely high volume training on muscle growth outcomes. And in almost all cases, this same dose-response relationship is seen, where more volume seems to result in greater muscle growth, even up to very high volumes. For example, this study compared the same training protocol with 16, 24, and 32 sets per muscle group per week. And as we can see, the same dose response was found, where more volume resulted in greater muscle growth. Furthermore, we also have this study, which used a similar study design. In this study, some muscle groups were trained with up to 45 weekly sets, which is extremely high volume by anyone's standards. And once again, more volume resulted in greater muscle growth. So it is quite clear from the scientific evidence that more volume results in greater muscle growth, even up to very high levels. However, this doesn't mean we can't see great long-term muscle growth with lower volumes. It just means that our rate of muscle growth will probably be faster with high volume training compared with a lower volume. Another consideration regarding training volume is volume efficiency. For this video, we will define this term as the amount of muscle growth seen per unit of volume, or per set in this case. If we take the previously mentioned study, we can divide the muscle growth achieved by the number of sets trained with to establish the metric of muscle growth per set, or volume efficiency. As we can see here, low volume training seemed to be a little bit more efficient and reduced slightly as volume increased. This suggests that as we perform more volume, the amount of muscle growth seen per set may not be as additionally effective. So the volume hypertrophy relationship may theoretically look something like this. While more volume does result in greater muscle growth, it may have diminishing returns as volume increases. This is likely a result of decreases in training quality as we perform more volume. As most of us can attest, towards the end of a high volume training session, our performance, focus, and intent tends to drop off. This means that the sets at the beginning of the session are usually of greater quality, while the sets at the end of the session are usually of lower quality. So as we perform more volume in each session, mental and physical fatigue accumulates, and we will likely progressively reduce training quality unintentionally. So now we understand how volume influences hypertrophy directly. It is pretty clear that more volume is likely to be beneficial for muscle growth, although this may follow a diminishing returns response. However, in practice, not all lifters can train with very high volumes. There is ultimately a finite amount of volume we can handle each week. This may be due to one of three primary limitations, which we will now cover. First is joint stress. While performing more volume results in superior muscle growth, it also results in greater overall joint and connective tissue stress. Each joint can only handle so much volume before it starts to become irritated and elicits a pain response. This could be due to many other factors too, but volume will play a major role. So if a trainee is experiencing joint pain or irritation in a specific region, they may need to reduce the number of sets that particular joint is involved with. This joint pain threshold will be different for everyone and may also change over a training career. So trainees should be adaptable in increasing or decreasing volume based on their joint tolerance. Another similar factor which may limit volume is systemic fatigue. This is a very vague and general term, but it can generally be described as fatigue of the entire organism, which affects all bodily systems. All forms of stress contribute to systemic fatigue, and resistance training is one of them. Furthermore, other sports or exercise and life stress also contribute and may breach our overall systemic capacity. Similar to joint stress, there is a finite amount of volume we can handle before we breach our systemic capacity and experience negative health and performance consequences. However, this is probably less of a concern for hypertrophy style training and more of a concern for strength training, but it is still a limitation to consider. And the last primary factor which may limit training volume is practical limitations. This is probably the most relevant limitation for hypertrophy training, as most of us don't have unlimited time and effort to train in the gym, due to various different reasons. This may be due to time limitations, other sport or exercise, or personal preference. For example, if we decide to dedicate 4 60-minute sessions per week to hypertrophy training, there is only so much volume we can perform in these sessions, so our volume will have to be capped at some point. Furthermore, even if a trainee has as much time as they want to dedicate to training, they may simply not want to lift for multiple hours per day. There are many practical limitations that we could discuss, but the key point to understand is that this may ultimately limit how much volume we can train with. So we understand that more weekly volume is generally more hypertrophic, although we should realize that this only really influences our rate of muscle growth, not necessarily our long-term development. If we perform a higher weekly volume, we will probably grow muscle at a faster rate, and if we perform a lower volume, our rate of muscle growth will probably be slower. However, in both cases, we are still going to make hypertrophy gains over time. We shouldn't think that we need to perform extremely high volumes to see any muscle growth. This is only required to maximize the rate of muscle growth at any given point in time. I prefer to look at volume over an entire training career rather than at any given week. If we train consistently for years on end, then we will accumulate lots of volume throughout our training career and will likely see great muscle growth even if weekly volume isn't substantially high. For example, someone who trains a muscle group with around 10 sets per week for 10 years will probably see greater muscle growth compared with a trainee performing 20 sets per week only for 2 years. This means that at any given point in time, we are still going to accumulate hypertrophy gains over time, just at different rates depending on our current volume levels. This may theoretically look something like this in a simplified graph. At some stages, we may see a faster rate of growth because we have more time and effort to dedicate to training, and we can train with higher volumes. And then at different points in our life, we may be training with lower volumes and still seeing some muscle growth over time, but just at a slower rate. One caveat to this is that we probably still require a minimum amount of volume to see any muscle growth. This threshold may be different for everyone and may change over time. However, we should realize that we can't expect to see muscle growth doing an extremely low volume over time. For example, if we regularly train with somewhere around 15 to 20 sets per week for a particular muscle, then we will probably see some temporary muscle loss if we were to only train with about 3 sets per week for an extended period of time. In this case, our minimum volume threshold may be somewhere around 8 sets, for example, for this muscle group per week. So if we train this muscle with anything lower than 8 sets, we will only see maintenance of muscle size over time at best and potentially see some muscle loss over time. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. Well, first and foremost, volume seems to significantly influence muscle growth. With all other factors equated, more volume generally results in greater overall muscle growth, or rather a faster rate of muscle growth. So we can achieve significant hypertrophy outcomes with lower volumes, but performing more sets per week will usually allow us to grow muscle faster. However, we can't perform an infinite amount of volume, as it will be limited in some capacity by either joint tolerance, systemic fatigue, or practical limitations. Therefore, it is recommended that trainees should perform as much volume as they can handle within these 3 primary constraints. Furthermore, our volume tolerance is likely to change across our training career. At certain times we may be able to handle more volume, and at other times we may perform less. However, it is really the total accumulation of volume over a training career that will ultimately be the biggest predictor of long-term muscle growth. So while we may see a slightly faster or slower rate of growth at different points in time, we ultimately want to simply perform enough volume to achieve a good hypertrophy stimulus and be consistent over time. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.